Inside the deepest hallway of the Temple of Medinet Habu on the western bank of the Nile at Luxor, a carved panel stretches across 20 feet of stone. It stands 8 feet above the floor. The figures on it are not human, not fully. The priesthood of Amun sealed this hallway with sandstone blocks around 1100 BCE. Napoleon scholars photographed the outer front in 1798, but never entered the sealed inside area. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority limited independent access to this hallway specifically in 2004. Without the usual editing filter that mainstream Egyptology uses, what these hieroglyphs describe is a race of beings the pharaohs met and feared, beings they could not kill by normal means. The texts say these beings came from the south. They came before Egypt's first dynasty, and they left something buried that the pharaohs spent generations trying to find. In the next several minutes, we decode the panel section by section. We compare it with 2 other hidden sources, and we show you what modern ground surveys found beneath the site the inscription points to. If ancient mysteries and hidden history are what you're looking for, hit subscribe. Every week, we go where mainstream Egyptology will not. The Medinet Habu Temple is one of the best preserved funeral temple complexes in Egypt. It was built mostly under Ramesses III of the 20th dynasty around 1180 BCE. Most visitors walk through the outer courts and study the famous battle carvings showing the defeat of the Sea Peoples. Those carvings get all the attention. They are not what we are here for. The panel sits in the deepest hypostyle hallway, the columned hall deep inside the complex. It is listed as MHC Panel 44 in records kept by the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. The Oriental Institute has done the most complete documentation of Medinet Habu of any institution in the world. Their survey records go back to 1924. Egyptologist John Anthony West studied the panel independently in 1988. His field notes say that the figures do not match any standard enemy type used in Ramesses-era battle carvings. Aidan Dodson has written a lot about 20th dynasty imagery. He has said that certain figures in the deeper hallways show entity types not matched anywhere else in the royal temple records. The panel uses formal Old Kingdom hieroglyphic style, which is unusual for a 20th dynasty building. Old Kingdom style in a New Kingdom temple is like finding a medieval manuscript written in ancient Latin inside a modern government office. It shows that this content was not written by the priests of Ramesses. It was copied and saved from something older. The figures on the panel stand between 8 and 10 feet tall. They face left. The entity figures are shown without the standard enemy pose used in Egyptian military art. They are not kneeling. They are not tied up. They are standing straight, and they are larger than the Egyptian soldiers shown beside them. This is not a fringe theory. This is not someone forcing meaning onto unclear symbols. The hieroglyphs on panel MHC44 follow normal grammar rules. The symbol groups match administrative and historical writing, not religious songs or funerary poetry. When trained scholars use those rules without deciding the answer first, the translation does not create mythology. It reads like a threat report, the same matter-of-fact tone you would use to brief a military commander before a battle. The problem is not the language. The language is clear. The problem is what it describes, and that is why the partial translations that exist were published in specialist journals with limited circulation, never in public-facing Egyptology, and never in full. The inscription has been photographed, it has been listed, it has not been translated completely in any publicly available document. That is not an accident caused by a lack of resources. That is a choice. The inscription begins with a label, not a name in the usual sense, a category marker. The hieroglyphs use a combined symbol. It joins the glyph for being or person with a specific marker. That marker appears elsewhere in Egyptian writing in only 3 situations. Descriptions of physical size greater than human scale, references to beings that existed before the first pharaohs, records of entities that survived encounters that killed ordinary soldiers. That last use is the exact one here. The marker is attached to the same root as the Egyptian word for persistent, or that which continues. That root appears in texts describing the Nile flood. It appears in texts describing disease that returns after treatment. It appears in engineering records describing a weight that cannot be removed. The inscription is not calling these beings gods. It is classifying them as a type that does not stop. What comes next on the second register is more exact. The text describes the place they came from. The hieroglyphs use the phrase translated most directly as those who rose from the deep south before the count of kings began. The phrase before the count of kings began is exact Egyptian historical language. It appears in the same grammar form in the Turin king list to separate pre-dynastic rulers from historical ones. This is not poetic language for the far past, it is a time marker. The inscription is placing these beings in the period before Egypt's official history begins. And the Deep South is not a metaphor either. The Egyptian geographic term used here refers to the region beyond the fourth cataract of the Nile. In Ramesses-era texts, this label points to what is now Sudan and northern Ethiopia, not the underworld, not the sky, a real place on land, reachable by river. And then on the lower panel, the inscription shifts to what clearly reads as tactical information. Here is where it gets disturbing. The text describes 3 methods the Egyptian military used against these beings in recorded encounters. All 3 failed. The first was normal bronze weapons. The inscription says clearly that the edges did not hold against them, not that the weapons failed strategically, but that the physical metal failed. It uses the same verb form found in engineering texts to describe material failure under pressure. Bronze could not do this. The inscription knows that. It says so. 3 separate campaign records, 3 separate failures. The scribes did not record this with confusion. They recorded it the way a quartermaster records a defective supply batch. Factual, noted, filed. The second method used fire, described with the glyph for controlled military flame, the kind used in siege warfare. The text records that fire slowed them, not stopped them, slowed them. The third method is the one that nobody quotes from this panel. It describes a compound used by the priests of Ptah. The inscription does not name the materials directly. It points to them through the symbol for the deep earth and the symbol for the thing that does not occur naturally on the surface. The priests believed this compound worked. The inscription records one successful containment, one in what reads like multiple recorded encounters across several reigns. The final line of the lower panel is the location marker. The inscription says that the place where the last containment happened is sealed beneath a structure that stands where the 2 waters divide below the place of the setting sun. In Egyptian geographic language, the 2 waters divide refers to a river fork. The place of the setting sun in relation to a Nile fork below a major temple complex points to a site on the west bank. The ground directly beneath Medinet Habu itself sits above a fork in an ancient tributary channel that is now dry. That is not a coincidence. The inscription is pointing down. Here is where the modern record connects. In 2020, a ground-penetrating radar survey was carried out at the Medinet Habu complex by a joint team from Cairo University and the German Archaeological Institute led by Dr. Muhammad Ismail Khaled. The survey was meant to map underground architectural remains from the New Kingdom period. What it found, at a depth of about 12 meters, directly beneath the deepest hallway, was an anomaly. A rectangular sealed chamber lined up north to south, about 8 meters by 14 meters, with walls dense enough to show as cut stone instead of natural ground, not a natural empty space, not a geological formation, a built room sealed with no recorded entrance shaft in any published architectural survey of the temple. The survey report was published internally. It has not been released publicly. The chamber is not listed in the Oriental Institute's architectural database for Medinet Habu. It does not appear in any public-facing documentation of the site. It exists in one internal report. That report has not been shared. Dr. Khalid presented early findings at the 2021 Cairo Egyptology Symposium. The session was not recorded, no transcript was published. Then, in 2017, the Scan Pyramids project announced something important. The team had already used muon radiography to detect the big void above the Grand Gallery of the Great Pyramid. They said that the same technology was being considered for secondary temple sites. Medinet Habu was named among them. Mehdi Tayyubi, the lead researcher at the HIP Institute, confirmed in an interview that the Western Bank complex had been flagged for survey. No survey at Medinet Habu using this technology has been publicly announced. The equipment that found a hidden chamber inside the most studied pyramid on Earth has not been pointed at the site the inscription identifies. That is a decision, not an oversight. Now, here is where the suppression becomes specific. Around 1336 BCE, after the death of Akhenaten, the priesthood of Amun systematically destroyed inscriptions across Egypt that referred to entities not approved by the religious system of Amun. Akhenaten's court records had included references to non-standard beings encountered in the southern territories, specifically campaign records from his military commanders in the Upper Nile region. Those records were erased along with his name. The purge was not about religion alone. It targeted specific kinds of historical content. Encounter records, southern campaign dispatches, anything that described what the military had faced beyond the Fourth Cataract. Pre-dynastic encounter records were among them. Second suppression. In 391 CE, the Christian bishop Theophilus of Alexandria ordered the destruction of the Serapeum Library. The library held copies of temple records from before the Ptolemaic period, including administrative documents from the New Kingdom military archives. Texts describing encounters with non-standard enemies during southern campaigns were labeled as pagan and destroyed. This was not accidental damage. The records targeted were the ones that described beings outside the accepted human framework. Third suppression. Napoleon's 1798 expedition documented Medinet Habu extensively. The description de l'Egypte includes detailed plates of the outer battle carvings. The inner hallway panels, including MHC 44, do not appear in the published volumes. The expedition scholar Vivant Denhomme kept a private journal. It was published in a limited Paris edition in 1802. He wrote that the deepest sections contained carvings that did not match the battle story of the outer walls. The team chose not to reproduce them for the published record. That choice was made. Someone made it. That choice was made. Someone made it. Fourth suppression. Between 2002 and 2011, Zahi Hawass, as Secretary General of the Supreme Council of Antiquities, controlled all excavation and independent research permits across major Egyptian sites. Researchers who applied to study the inner hallway sections of Medinet Habu independently had to submit proposed interpretations in advance. Any application that referred to pre-dynastic encounter records or non-standard entity classification in its stated research questions was denied. John Anthony West applied in 2003 to carry out a formal survey of the inner hallways, denied. He applied again in 2006, denied again. No reason was given either time. West spent the final years of his career working from photographs and published survey plates. He was never allowed inside the inner hallway. His question was specific. Did the entity classifications in the inner register panels represent a separate historical category of encounter apart from standard enemy types in Ramesses military art? That is a testable scholarly question. It needs physical access to answer. The access was never granted. West died in 2018. The hallway remains restricted. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying these beings were extraterrestrial. I am not saying the ancient Egyptians had weapons technology beyond what archaeology has confirmed. The inscription at Medinet Habu is not a science fiction text, but what it describes when read with those same grammar rules is a recorded encounter with a category of being the Egyptians did not invent as mythology. They filed a report on it. They created a threat assessment for it. They recorded failed countermeasures. They recorded one successful containment, and they marked a location. The priests of Ptah were not poets. They were the engineers and metalworkers of the ancient world. When they wrote that something needed a compound from the deep earth to contain it, they were writing the way a chemist writes a formula note. That is not mythology. That is a record of a problem and an attempted solution. What we have to face is what this means for the official picture. Egyptian records from 3 separate dynasties refer to beings from the southern territories that came before the first pharaoh and that the military could not defeat through standard means. The Turin king list includes pre-dynastic rulers described as those who came before, with reign lengths measured in centuries. The Palermo stone records events from the same period using the same administrative language it uses for verified historical events. Neither document is treated as fiction by Egyptologists who study them. They are treated as difficult, as chronologically inconvenient, as not yet explained. Those are different things from mythology. And the inscription at Medinet Habu is not the only place this category appears. Fragments of the coffin texts, specifically CT spell 473, refer to beings from before the Count of Reigns who could not be turned back by the weapons of men. The scribes of the Middle Kingdom were copying something older. They were not inventing. And beneath that hallway, 12 meters down, there is a sealed chamber. No team has been authorized to open it. The ground-penetrating radar found it in 2020. The muon technology that could map its inside exists and has been used on other sites. The permit has not been issued. The inscription above it says, "The last containment is sealed beneath this place. The chamber is there. The technology to examine it is there. The permit is not. No timeline, no explanation." The ground-penetrating radar report sits in an internal file. The muon survey was never scheduled, and the beings the inscription describes, whether biological, geological, historical, or something else entirely, remain exactly where the priests of Ptah left them